I am Ben Doc Askins, the psychedelic science war storyteller, and this is the Anti-Hero's Journey podcast. It's Doc Askins coming at you with another one of my favorite podcasts, the Q5 podcast, where I ask my 5 favorite questions to people of widely diverse backgrounds, and we compare notes. Let's see how similar and how different we all really are when you scratch a little bit below the surface. Today, I've got a treat for you. I've got Dr. Dru Johnson. He's a visiting associate professor at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. He was a professor at the King's College in New York City previously, and he's the director of the Center for Hebraic Thought, editor at the Biblical Mind, host of the Biblical Mind podcast, and co-host of the OnScript Podcast. Before that, he was a high school dropout, skinhead, punk rock drummer, combat veteran, IT supervisor, and pastor. All things that he hopes none of his children ever become. I love this bio, bro. It might be the best one so far. What was that?
You're old hardcore too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Syracuse hardcore was my thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Midwest.
You remembered.
Yeah.
Yeah, outstanding, man. I love bringing you on this podcast. It's going to be a good time. I'm excited to have this conversation for sure. Here, I'm going to tell a story. I don't usually do this, but since we know each other, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tell the origin story of our friendship my way, and we'll see if you remember how this went. But we were at an after conference, theological, philosophical conference of some variety or another in Texas.
I am now starting to remember.
Yeah. We were at an after party, and we were having a few drinks with a few folks. Some people were drinking water. Some people were drinking wine. It was kind of a Jesus event. And
well, there were Baptists there. So.
they're like I said, people were chugging water. You got to stay hydrated, and I don't hate them for it. But at the time, I had already started pursuing a PhD in the book of Job, but I was on the fence about whether or not to go into the inter-service physician assistant program and pursue a medical career. And I was, kind of picking your brain and another mutual friend of ours, Dr. Jonathan Pennington. And the two of you were influential in kind of steering me away from academe and towards medicine. And I am eternally grateful to both of you for your
I think we're kind of happy how that turned out as well.
Mentorship in that regard.
You're doing real things in the world.
Meant the world to my wife and children for sure, if not to me. But I remember that we were having a few drinks, and I, as veterans often do, made an off-color joke about my level of skill with drunk driving, and you shot right back with, my sister was killed by a drunk driver. And I knew one of two things was true. Either number one, you've used that in all these Christian academic circles and pulled that one off on a whole bunch of people, and it's a good pushback on a joke like that, right? Yeah. Or you're the kind of guy who turns that serious that fast on something that's obviously a joke. So if it was option 2, I knew we could never be friends.
Yeah.
And if it was option 1, I was going to call bullshit immediately. So I called bullshit immediately, and we've been friends ever since. Yeah. At least Facebook friends.
I forgot I did that, but I'm like, yep, that sounds on par for exactly what I would do. Someone did that to me when I was deployed. I think I'm probably 19 years old on my first combat deployment. The whitest lieutenant you've ever seen in your life. I mean, he's a captain maybe, but he's just straight white dude. Looked like he walked off of a beach bum movie or something. And I said something about Vietnam. My dad, it's well, my dad killed a lot of Vietnamese in Vietnam. And he just looked at me and he goes, my mother was Vietnamese. And I could not read the situation for the life of me.
I'm trapped.
Yeah. And ever since then, it actually took me, I think, a day or two. And I probably poked around a little bit to ask around to figure out that his mother was not actually Vietnamese, but I was like, man, that's a good one. So
We used to one more story and then we'll get to the questions. We used to do that on the high school wrestling team where I was captain my senior year, And there was this game we'd play where you'd get like a freshman to come ask one of the captains about like, hey, they'd play it up and say like, hey, ask Ben about his grandpa. His grandpa can do 1,000,000 push-ups. Like he loves talking about his grandpa. And then this poor little freshman would come over and say like, hey, like I heard your grandpa could do like 1,000,000 push-ups or whatever. And you would have to, without knowing that it was coming, turn as like dark serious as you possibly could and yell at the kid, my grandpa doesn't have any arms. Just say something that ridiculous, that seriously. And it, like I was pretty good at pulling it off.
So what's wrong with us that we enjoy this so much?
Yeah. I don't know. Like I work in mental health, but it's a mystery to me.
Yeah. Okay. Fair.
Anyway, now that we've had a little trip down memory lane, let's get rocking and rolling with question number 1. What's your story?
I don't know what that word means. Look, what does it mean? Like, what's your deal? That's what I... Like, Drew, what's the deal with that dude?
Sup, bro?
Yeah. What's your story? My story is well, here I'll have PhD students who sometimes contact me and say like, hey, I read your bio and I saw you were a pastor and you did all these other things and now you're doing this academic thing. I want to know how to do what you did. And my answer is always the same. Like, I didn't plan any of this, didn't plan on any of it. I didn't plan on going to seminary. I didn't plan on going to the PhD program. It all happened, I would say providentially, but just like my life story is stumbling backwards into things. Even this next thing I'm going to be working on this next year, wasn't looking for it. It just like dropped in my lap. So I'm not ambitious. I don't have really any like real ambition outside of like, I want to be able to stand up under my own power when I'm 80 years old. Like that's what gets me to the gym, basically.
That's a good one. Yeah.
And I don't have a lot of like career ambitions. If you say like, what are you going to be doing in 5 to 10 years? I have no idea. And I don't really care that much. If I'm not in academics, I'm sure I'll be happy doing something else. So I don't really have a story. There's no like through line outside of like, I just kept stumbling into things and I just go like, okay, I'll do this.
Yeah. Well, run us through your version, the Cliff's Notes of high school dropout, skinhead, punk rock drummer, combat veteran, IT supervisor, pastor.
Wow, that's pretty good. Yeah, I mean, I went to high school in Oklahoma. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Never really went anywhere except for New York City in the 80s. I would stay with my uncle in New York City in the 80s, and I don't know how to tell people what that's like. Outside of that, my uncle, God bless him, I love this guy to death. He's an S&M performance artist. That's what he does now. In his 70s. But to be fair, he's been doing it for like 30 years.
He's an old pro.
Yeah, but I'm like 12, 13 years old staying with him over the summer because my mom sent me up there. And like first thing, he takes me to Times Square to get a fake ID. And Times Square where you get fake IDs and see strip shows and that kind of. This is back in the 80s. And then we went out
shows.
And then we went to like comedy clubs until 3 a.m. and where they had 2 drink minimum. So I'm still looking back going, I was a late bloomer. I didn't even hit puberty till 15. And they're serving me like White Russians all night long at the comedy club. So yeah, I was, but I grew up in Oklahoma, and basically my parents divorced. My dad moved to another state, and I think that left a huge hole in for me. And so I was looking for male companionship wherever I could find it. Had a few teachers that worked out. Actually, one teacher who was an Army helicopter pilot, he died actually in a night vision training exercise.
Oh, wow.
The year I was his like lab assistant after my dad left. So that was it was a bad arrangement. I mean, it's
double tap.
Bad for him, but it hit me particularly hard. And then, as I got into heavy metal and hardcore and punk and stuff, a group of us just was like, hey, let's just become skinheads. And it wasn't the racist variety, of course. My stepdad's black, raised in Jim Crow South in the 1940s and 50s. So we weren't thinking about those kinds. And my sister's black or half black, as they say. So, but I liked all the like, hey, what do we do? Well, we get drunk and we fight. It's like, sounds great. I'm up for that.
More SLC punk skinhead than American History X skinhead, right?
Yeah. When I saw SLC punk, I was like, holy cow, they're like, even some of the characters in there, I was like, hey, we had a guy just like that in our scene,
Yeah. Yeah.
Although I knew a guy who American History X was based off of. He's one of several guys who fit that category.
Sure.
Lived
It's
with
composite.
lived with that guy, wide area resistance guy in California. Like, he had told me stories that showed up in that movie. I was like, holy cow, he wasn't making that up. But he was a convert as well. When he was a neo-Nazi, went to prison for gassing a synagogue in Dallas, and then kind of saw the light and came out of it. So that was my world in high school. And I worked at a pub,
Yes.
and so I drank most of my nights away. And and by the time you have to get up for school in the morning, I just wasn't motivated and wasn't fascinated. So I really just didn't. I failed out of high school just because I didn't really care, didn't do anything about it, wasn't interested. And then
Sure.
after I failed out, though, that's when I was like, okay. And this is in the late 80s, early 90s in Tulsa, where there was actually a lot of, there's a big FBI sting that was getting ready. I did not know this, but it was getting ready to go down, that raked up a lot of these neo-Nazi groups.
Okay.
So we got pulled over. Anytime we were out, they see bald heads in the car. Tulsa police or the sheriffs pull you over, handcuff you, take pictures of your tattoos and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And we were lucky because they were, we might have been drunk driving or doing something stupid or breaking the law, but they just wanted to know whether we were neo-Nazis. And once they figured out we weren't, they kind of cut us loose. Even like in some ways, I'm like, why did they cut us? That was dangerous. They let us, like, we had a case of beer in the car still, and they just cut us loose. So I dropped out, moved up to St. Louis where my dad was, and then basically I was like, I got to find something to do with my life. High school dropout. So I joined a reserve unit and went away for 2 years active duty, or went away for a year active duty of training and then a year back active duty with the unit. And then I went on part-time. I was on and off active duty with this unit, but I was getting deployed all the time for good training. And then I started volunteering to be deployed all the way through college. Went to college, worked full-time as an IT guy at a federal center, and then was just deploying 2 to 3 times a year.
All the Christmases.
Yeah, I volunteered for every Christmas, so I didn't have Christmas, so I didn't have to be around. And when I was about 20, I think about 2 rotations in, and these are short, like 1-2 month deployments, very short. This is before 9/11. This is the early 90s. I became a Christian, not of my own volition, really. It wasn't like I decided to become a Christian or I knelt down and accepted Jesus into my heart, but I had a serious conversation with God. I wasn't really religious, but I'd had some experiences down in Colombia doing these kind of narcotics that I was like, man, humans are messed up. And a Christian guy said, hey, you can talk to God about this. I was like, I don't really do the God thing. And so then I got to the point where I was like, screw it, what can it hurt? And I started talking to God, and then I had one of those day and night, got changed existentially, and I was like, excuse me, I was stuck just basically trying to explain what happened to me. And the more I read the book of Acts more than anything else, that's why I was like, I think something like this happened to me. I think this is it, And then I reluctantly, about a year later, admitted I'd become a Christian. Okay. And then, and then I kind of just went down that path. Always skeptical of everything, which I think has helped in the scholarly pursuits as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Got married, adopted 2 children, had 2 accidents. 4
2 beautiful accidents, right?
4 accidents, 2 outsourced to Guatemala, 2 in-house. So yeah, we only had we stopped at 4. Not our choice, but we stopped at 4. And now the older 3 are living back in New York City, and the baby is a senior in high school now. So.
Oh wow, man! I didn't know your kids were that old. Wow.
They're old. Yeah. Which means correspondingly that
implications.
I am old.
I understand implications. Yeah. Wow. So that kind of brings us more or less up to date. You want to tell us any of your you got more degrees than Fahrenheit along the way by accident somehow or something?
I finished my undergrad in psychology, and the guy who kind of coached me into what had happened to me, and was kind of a pastor to me, or like a mentor to me. He taught me into going to seminary, and then once he explained to me what seminary was and what they do there, he talked me into doing this guy, he talked me into doing a 4-year full-time degree, right? An MDiv, which was 110 credit hours when I did it.
I
So
know.
it's a
Yeah.
massive beast, right? I was like, you only get a master's after all of that?
It's a professional degree, but it's
yeah,
graduate.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Honestly, the hardest academic thing I've ever done in my life was that MDiv.
Oh yeah.
The other master's
Greek and
degrees
Hebrew are not to be messed with. Yeah.
Well, I was a horrible writer. I wasn't a good reader. The PhD was a cakewalk in comparison.
Because you got to focus, right?
Oh yeah, I just got to sit there and read and write what I thought what I was finding. So yeah, you're only doing one thing, and apparently, even though I think I have some ADHD, I can maybe because I'm a child of the 70s, I can sit for 8 hours in focus.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I did that master's, and then I started working as a pastor at the church where I was going, and immediately started a master's in philosophy because I had philosophical questions. And again, that was a frustrating degree because they did a very particular type of analytic philosophy that I wasn't super keen into. But I finished it off. And then I did another master's back at seminary, like a research degree, or I started on one. I didn't finish it. And then I went over to Scotland and did a PhD. And again, the reason I went to Scotland, wasn't planning on it. I was at Oxford giving a paper in a philosophy conference. And a guy said, hey, you should talk to this guy at St. Andrews in Scotland. He talks about philosophy the same way you do, and not like all of these people, right? So I just sat down with them. We arranged a coffee together, and after an hour and a half of him grilling me with every question under the sun about what I thought about things, I was like, this is a very aggressive conversation. At the end,
come at me, bro.
Right. I mean, I enjoyed it, but it was like, he's like, what do you think of this? Okay, what do you think of this?
Realism versus anti-realism, go.
It was down in the weeds real quick. And then at the end of it, he just goes like, well, I'd like you to come here and do a PhD with me. And the guy who arranged the meeting, I didn't realize in the British system, that means you're in the program. Like that.
Yeah. You got like the secret handshake. You can join the Skulls and Sabers and all of that stuff. Yeah. Like,
filing an application was just
you're a made man.
Exactly. So yeah, we sold our house and moved our 4 small children over to St. Andrews, Scotland, and 2 years later finished that, and then came back and been working in New York City at King's College ever since, until this last few months ago when King's closed.
Yeah, that's too bad. I didn't know that till we were talking today. Yeah.
Yep. So so I think that catches everything up.
What was the dissertation in?
I forget what it's called, but it was something like epistemology in the Torah, the Pentateuch, first 5 books, and the Gospel of Mark. So,
yeah, you go with the little gospel because you picked the whole book of the law, right?
Honestly, that's how dumb I was. I was like, I'm going to do the synoptics, and then I realized at some point I can't do Matthew, Mark, and Luke because it's just too much. So I'm like, I'm just going to do Mark. I did not know. I honestly did not know that there is like 3 times as much secondary literature on Mark's gospel as there are the other.
Right, because of Q and all of that bullshit, right? Yeah.
As soon as they discovered Mark and priority, then it exploded. Yep. So it actually, I mean, there's a 200.
You shot yourself in the foot. Like, Mark's really tiny. I'll do Mark.
16 chapters. What's there to read? There's a.
Everybody else is cribbing Mark's work, though. That's the problem, right?
There's a 250-page book published. I forget the guy's name. It's just a bibliography of secondary Markan literature since 1920 or something like that.
Oh my God,
it's insane. So yeah, I did that, and then I was really interested in theories of knowledge in the Hebrew biblical tradition, and then the New Testament as well. And then since then, I've gotten to ritual quite a bit, which is the embodied stuff and PTSD, and started the more I started reading on that, I was like, oh hey, this starts to explain some experience of mine and people I knew. And then I've been really into, excuse me, kind of the intellectual world of the ancient Near East and where the Hebrews fit into that. So how do they compare to the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Greco-Romans?
Yeah, that's super interesting stuff for sure.
Yeah, crazy stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very crazy.
Ancient Aliens, History Channel sort of stuff.
I'm still like a little, I've written articles against conspiracy theorizing, and that I think Christians shouldn't do this stuff specifically, but man, they get me every time with that, like that hard granite, like what cuts those tools in ancient Egypt. And I'm just like, that is a tough one.
That's a toughie.
Yeah. I'm highly skeptical, but completely.
We live in a
open
simulation.
to having everything overthrown on a dime. And I think part of that is because I've had it happen before, where I thought the world was one way, and then surprise, surprise, it actually wasn't. So I'm
Sure.
skeptical,
There's
but
all those
open.
paradigm shifts,
Yep,
right,
yep.
along the way. We used to think. Everybody used to think.
That old Bill Murray school.
Phlogiston was the thing that was.
It's like, well, at one point we thought this was, worms that are consuming your wife's body, but now we know it's little gnomes on the inside. Yeah.
Oh, he's such a genius. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome, man. So yeah, you feel like that catches us up to the present day, plus plus or minus some pyramid.
Yeah, we lived in Brazil for a little while as a family.
Oh yeah,
we lived in Israel for a little while on sabbatical. We lived back in St. Andrews, and so yeah, we traveled a lot as a family, which is
nice.
Great. Yeah, if you want to kill your child's desire of wanderlust, like that they're going to go
just drag them across the globe. Yeah.
My kid's favorite place is New Jersey. Like whoever thought that would happen, right?
Yeah. I want to pick your brain sometime. Maybe now is not the best time on like Gnostic Gospels and the Gospel of Thomas and Q theory stuff. Sometime like that stuff.
It'll be a short pick.
Will it? Okay. Talking to the wrong guy.
I mean, I got
because I'm just curious about it. It was definitely not anything we ever read about in seminary, right?
Oh, okay.
And
I make my students read it because I'm like, I don't need to tell you about this stuff. Just go read it for yourself, and you'll see a lot of what people are talking about.
Yeah, it's not real long. It's way shorter than Mark.
Short reading. Yeah, exactly.
Right on. Well, cool. That's an outstanding story. I appreciate you. That level of openness and talking to us about that. I ask about people's stories to talk about like where they're from and their memories and those sorts of things. And then the second question is about what are your intentions, which is just transitioning towards the future.
Yeah, well, I think you heard I don't have any intentions. I get them kind of assigned to me as I go when I
kind of a Lebowski of the Hebraic thought.
Like, exactly. Like I'm over here signing checks for 69 cents, for cream.
Get those white Russians at the peep show.
White Russians, yep. So yeah, I do. I'm very animated by the idea that kind of everybody overlooks the Hebrew Bible as a philosophical text and that it's an actual intellectual tradition. I wrote a book for Cambridge Press, like making the big argument for that. And it's true. I'm in a work group with a Syriologist, an Egyptologist, and classicist. So these are people who they read all those clay tablets in cuneiform and Egyptian tablets and stuff. And it's funny how and I've been reading a lot more of that in the last few years because of being in that work group. And I just didn't realize that the Hebrew Bible is very different than all of those. It's being created in that time, in the same time period, kind of in parallel. But it's just doing such different things and quite honestly, just such exponentially more sophisticated things. And that's not my opinion. That's that's the opinion of the people who work on the text of those regions.
Wow.
And these are not like confessional Christians or Jews. These are people who are mostly agnostic or atheists who are saying like, yeah, Hebrew Bible's over there with kind of like the Greco-Roman tradition as far as sophistication of thought. So that gets me animated. A little bit of like classism. I hate progressivism that kind of says those are primitive ancient people and moderns who figure this all out and
kind of condescending.
Yeah. And it also creates genocide and that kind of stuff. So
yeah, there's that little problem that we've had forever. Elaborate on sophistication for me. What do you mean there?
Yeah, I mean, like, if you say something like, how do you know something, right? I think what happens is people read the Bible and they go like, well, these are really weird stories if they're in the story part, or the laws are like, man, these are archaic. And I'm writing a book right now on how do you read biblical law. And honestly, the hardest task of that book is like almost everything and think about law is wrong for biblical law. It's all been created past the Greeks, and then you're projecting all of these ideas of legal theory back onto something that just doesn't want them. So I think a lot of times we're reading it wrongly, or we just see it as a bunch of stories or poetry, and we don't value that as like making arguments about the nature of reality itself and how the world works and how humans work and how we know things and slicing and dicing shrewd realities. So, for instance, I would say I don't think it's an accident. I can't explain it genetically, but I don't think it's an accident that the scientific enterprise kind of started out with heavy influence from Greek philosophy, and quite
Sure.
honestly, let's just call it what it is: Greek theology, right? Belief in the divine and certain divine
Oh, yeah.
ideas. And over the centuries and millennia now has basically gotten rid of almost every single one of those Greek ideas and landed in what I would call a Hebrew view of the world. The world is real, law-like, and knowable. It's not fundamentally deceptive. Our sensory input is not fundamentally flawed. It can be flawed, but it's not fundamentally flawed. There's no spirits or animation, hiding behind everything. We essentially rejected all of those ancient worldviews except for the Hebrew worldview, which also, and as you read through those stories, you realize that it affirms over and over again, investigating, creating null hypotheses, double checking to make sure, in all kinds of ways. And what one University of Chicago professor back in the 1940s called the skeptical mood of the Hebrew Bible, that you really have to double check things and make sure that's what's really going on. And you see that sewn into its stories, its law and its poetry. But if you think story, law, and poetry can't do heavy philosophical lifting, then you kind of write it off. You don't even take it seriously to begin with.
Yeah, it's dismissive.
Yeah, and I used to teach intro to philosophy, and like if you teach intro to philosophy today, and you have students read a bunch of different philosophical texts over the millennia, they're reading all of those kinds of texts. They're reading Socratic dialogues, which are stories about an old crotchety man wandering around pissing everybody off. They're reading or Nietzsche
until they kill him for it.
Or Nietzsche, who is the old crotchety man pissing everybody off. But he writes
the madman.
With treatises, poetry. I mean, like everything that you can imagine, every type of literary style you can imagine is used in intro to philosophy class. But for some reason, I think it's just because the Western world is mainly Judeo-Christianized. They look at those texts and they go like, oh, those are just religious texts. And I'm like,
yeah,
well, yeah, they are, but they're doing a lot more than that. And I think Christians get this wrong as well.
Oh yeah, oversimplifying things, reductionism,
not listening to it.
false dilemmas, all of those sorts of things are just kind of in the air we breathe that we inherited from the so-called Enlightenment.
Yes. we need another, like so-called Enlightenment. We need something else. It's like, because in some ways Enlightenment is a version of darkening people's minds. As Calvin would say, their minds were darkened and clouded by their great unknowing, right?
Yeah, what's a better word for it?
Enlightenment?
Disenchantment.
I mean, that's actually a technical term that people often use, the disenchanting of the world, right?
Right.
And I don't know. We're not going to solve this in the next 30 minutes.
Maybe you won't.
The great darkening. That sounds racist,
though. The snuffing. That's not the right word.
The logicizing,
of a candle. Just a candle. That's all we're talking about.
Actually, if I were to use an embodied metaphor, I'd say it was the great myopia, where they think they're narrowing down on what's going to help them to figure everything out, and they're actually excluding lots of routes to get there.
Yeah. If I remember right, and you'd be the one to correct me if I don't, like vision is a very important part of the philosophy of science in the Hebrew Bible and in Michael Polanyi's work around, epistemology in that regard.
Yeah,
so
and actually in most
languages
and conceptual schemes, vision is the primary metaphor for, although all the senses are used for knowing something or understanding something, vision is typically the primary one.
We do give a certain amount of primacy to that, just as humans with eyes up high on the front of our faces,
Which also admits to the necessity of community in all knowing, right? Because you can only see.
You don't have eyes in the back of your head, bro? I got eyes in the back of my head.
The only thing I have back
yes.
Which is the weakest form of "don't shoot me."
Yeah. I had, like, when we were in Iraq on base, it was stupid, and we'd be walking around with PT belts on, on base in a war zone. And I had this captain that wrote "shoot me" on his PT belt. Like, why are we wearing these? Why are we wearing these around? It was like Super Garrison. It was the
if you're
stupidest
shooting
place
anybody
I've ever
inside
been.
the wire, like you better have like
Right.
5 reasons lined up.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. It was the silliest thing. We don't want you to get run over by a truck. What?
Yeah.
What?
You know, it's funny. They started doing all of that after, because like when I went through boot camp, now granted it was Air Force boot camp, but it was July and August in San Antonio.
It was soft shoe camp.
Yeah. Well, I think I've told you my joke. I tell students, I was like, well, I wanted to join the military, but I joined the Air Force. So
that's what all the smart people do, man.
And but even then, in July and August in San Antonio, Texas, we didn't even have water bottles on us. We didn't carry canteens, nothing.
Oh wow!
And I've noticed. I've driven through there since then. I noticed everybody's got like double canteen straps.
Yeah. The pendulum has swung the other way on that one. Even when I went through basic training, 10,000 years ago or whatever, we had a 2-quart canteen that we had to have on us all the time, and I missed that thing after I was.
I was a water hog.
I just want to drink.
Yeah. And where did you go through boot camp?
Fort Relaxin' Jackson, South Carolina.
No Lost in the Woods for you. Okay.
No. So I deployed with the MPs, so I've heard all the tales of getting lost in the woods, but
we used to
never been there myself.
There, so just for fun.
Okay. In Missouri.
Missouri.
Right on. Yeah. Hobbled. Let's see. So those are some digressions around your intentions, and they're fun.
I have ADHD, right? I did say that. Right?
Yeah. So I call it what you described. I call attention surplus hyperactivity disorder. I'd have like I can hyper focus for sure for a real long time, but there's definitely a hyperactivity component to it too. But the way that I like to stitch together the past and the future when I ask people these questions is with gratefulness. So the third question is, what are you grateful for?
Yeah. Well, because I lost my job alongside all my colleagues who just lost their job. And when we've been together on this, I like to say King's College was a small, like 600 student college in the middle of Manhattan, like Wall Street and Broadway, basically, is where I worked for 12 years.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, I kind of jokingly say I've been working for a startup for the last 12 years because startups are only supposed to be a startup for like 3 years, and then they move into regular operation, but it never made it past startup phase. So there was a lot of heave-hoeing and a lot of everybody putting in 120%, and we were all very committed to the cause. There were no people punching the clock there. And so looking, it was kind of an open wound that we slowly realized, like, through financial problems, we're just going to have to close the college, and we just all have to find somewhere to work, which how difficult it is to find somewhere to work. Mm-hmm. However, the thing that I never got, maybe I should have, maybe I'm a sociopath, but I never really got sad. The overwhelming feeling that I had was gratefulness for all the experiences I'd had there, all this, like, I had only undergrad students, but I can't tell you how many of them I learned from. How many things I just learned about culture and the world. They would bring all kinds of weird stuff into class, but also that they just kind of like, and they grew up, and they became family friends of ours. Everywhere I've lived overseas, we've had students come stay with us. Former students, and so good friendships. It's great getting to watch people grow up. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful for kind of, my wife and my kids who have also taught me, like, anything I thought I knew, my kids and my wife have like helped me see the error in my ways. Like I always put a pretty heavy, I've got 9 books, right? And I always put a pretty heavy thanks to my wife and kids. But it's not token ever. Like everything I'm writing on, it really is like I would have seen this completely different if I didn't experience the world with them and have them point out things to me that I would have never noticed. I think you can tell my great fear is that I have completely misunderstood something or missed the boat. And so I'm most grateful when I look around people who help me not to miss things. So,
yeah. That's beautiful, man.
Yeah, I love it. Family, my parents, even my mom, who was a crazy, like, neo-pagan lesbian for the last 25 years of her life. I mean, she was just a little out there.
Yeah.
And she had very good reasons for being way out there. She had lots of trauma from her childhood that she was working through as hard as she could. But man, I now she died in the first summer of COVID, and I look back and every time I think of her, I'm like, man, I learned so much from that woman. Even in her craziness, so much good stuff that came forward. So I think I'm just appreciative of everybody that I would say God has kind of walked into my life and why they're there. Even some people who, one dude who gave me a lot of trouble a few years ago, who I think I would have naturally wanted to be enemies with this guy and destroy him. But I think God gave me some grace, and I just prayed for this guy a lot. And actually I learned a lot about conspiracy thinking from this one guy. He accused me of plagiarism. Professionally accused me of plagiarism.
Yeah, sure.
I had to do all kinds of investigations and stuff.
Brought you into the witch trials that academics still run for whatever reasons.
Why are those trials so vicious? Because the stakes are so darn low, right? It's not like anybody's making money on it.
Are we going to burn him alive this time? No. We might flick his ear.
But even that dude, even him in that circle, I learned. Yeah, so you can hear it. I feel like a dunce most of the time. So I'm always grateful for people who are patient enough to point me down the road and say, "Do you see that thing? You need to pay attention to that." So, and now my kids are young adults. So it's so embarrassing when your 21-year-old comes to you and they're like, "Dad, I need to talk to you," and you're like, "Ah, crap.
What did I do now? Just tell me. Get it over with."
It's like the reversal of the situation, and every single time I'm like, "You're right. I didn't even think about that. I didn't realize."
Oh man, I half joke around that my 9-year-old daughter runs everything, and it's a half joke. There are times where I'm just like, I don't know. Let's ask her.
Yeah.
And she nails it, and I'm like, oh yeah, why didn't I see that? All right, let's all go do that. She's gonna take over the world someday. Y'all watch out for her.
All right, next podcast.
So, with all of your story and all your intentions and all your gratefulness, what are you creating?
I feel like I just create crap all day long.
We all do that.
Despite the futility of writing a book, I'm always working on the next book, which I think is stupid. And then I do. I mean, it does feel very silly.
No, I get it. Now that I wrote one, I understand it better than I ever did before, right?
Yeah. In the process, you end up having to read that.
I got so many good ideas. Oh,
yes.
Everybody should hear my ideas. I should make them ink so that they're real.
And there's the more seductive side of that when a publisher comes to you and be like, "Hey, could you write a book on this? We really want to hear what you have to say." And my wife has been great at teaching me how to say no to things. But yeah, it does. I have been creating a lot of written stuff. And again, it's usually where I'm like, nobody's talking about this. Why aren't they talking about this? Let me, in the most pugnacious academic way possible, get people talking about this. So I told you I have this book on Darwinism coming out. Not because I know anything about that. I mean, I did take sabbatical and I did read a lot of science journal articles. I reread Darwin. I caught up to speed. But it's not like
went back and read the cuneiform on Darwin.
I'm not any kind of expert on it, but I did notice that everybody's missing a big chunk of the conversation, and everybody wants to focus over here. And so, as the editor, he said he called it a very disruptive book. So I always have energy for disruptive books.
I like that. Yeah.
But I don't. But constructive stuff, I'm not so great at. I'm only good at swinging a sledgehammer in this world.
Let's make the playing field level. All right, y'all go play. I don't know how to do that.
Exactly. But there's some listener will know, but there's one of Nietzsche's books. I forget which one. It may be The Gay Science, but it's called the subtitle is Philosophizing with a Sledgehammer. That's the actual subtitle. And I'm like, that's kind of where that's where I fit into the world.
I forget the quote. It was from an old World War II tank commander, I think, who it was. But it was occasionally it's entirely appropriate to swat a fly with a sledgehammer.
Right, exactly. That's all I'm good for. Exaggerated claims and, a little bit of evidence to back it up.
just enough evidence to keep the witch trials at bay most of the time.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Nice.
But it's a book on Darwin for Christians, so who knows? The crazies are going to come out of the woodwork. I'm like, should I just change all my email addresses now?
You're just dog whistling ahead of time, like, hey, come on out.
Yeah. Please write that 2,000-word email to me showing me why I'm completely wrong. No, the book's not even out yet. You haven't read it, but you probably need to let me know.
Yeah, let me.
That's how it happens. I'm sure you've gotten some of that.
People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. They're just letting you know they care, Drew. They want to send the email ahead of time, and then they'll read it.
True. I mean, you can't poke these bears without expecting them to pick you up. And
they're paper tigers, every single one of them. Come at me.
They want to wipe your butt with them, or they want to wipe their butts with your fur. That's what it is. That's the joke.
Yep. Yeah. Nice. Let's see. What friggin' question are we on? I don't even care. Oh yeah. All right. We got done with creating, and then there's the fifth and everybody's favorite final question. Who are you really, Dru Johnson?
I went to therapy last year, so I actually have a good handle on this one. Internal family systems therapy. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes. Yeah. Sure.
It's not for everybody. You got to be at a certain place in life to handle that kind of therapy.
It's pretty prominent in the psychedelic assisted therapy, literature and practice at this point. It pairs well in IFS parts work.
I'm sure part of it was the skill of the guy I was working with, but it goes so deep so quickly, and I had very precise things I knew weren't right, and I wanted to work on them. So I think the truth is, and nobody would be surprised who knows me, is that I am a scared 8-year-old boy who is looking for everything to be solid and stable and not move around at all. And so I've slowly warmed up to the waters that everything moves and nothing is really stable except for very few things. And that's okay. And kind of learning how to become confident in a world where everything is moving and not stable, and still help people along the way. So that's who I really am. And so you scratch me or say the wrong thing or push me or say something I don't like, that 8-year-old boy is going to strike with a vengeance.
Yeah.
But I'm keeping him mostly comforted these days and be like, we're good. Everything's good. I got a great family, got a great life. And if it goes away tomorrow, it'll still have been a great ride. So
Yeah, that's beautiful, man. I appreciate that level of vulnerability answering that question and authenticity for sure.
Okay, when do I get to ask you a question?
Well, you host a whole bunch of podcasts for a real long time, and I've gotten 0 invitations so far.
That's true. Mostly that's because I've been looking for a job.
Tables have turned. I've read all your books. How many of mine have you read, Drew?
Oh my goodness. Yours is actually look, do you see all these books? I haven't read any of these books. These are my to-read books.
Right, exactly.
But yours
this is just my pretentious wall of knowledge that I have not yet acquired.
In fact, I do have actually stacks of books here that are on my to-read list. But yours is high up on mine because yours sounds interesting. I was like, I know this is going to be good.
It's a trip.
Yeah.
It's a trip.
I do have one question for you.
Lay it on me.
Family member. So I have a family member who got into Michael Pollan's book early on and How to Change Your Mind. And and this family member knew that I did LSD when I was a teenager. And so they started asking questions about, what do you think about this? And so they ended up doing MDMA and mushroom and LSD guided tour pretty regularly with 3 friends. And they're
all at once, or this is like a series of fortunate events, or
all guided, all of course in the Northeast. These are wealthy white elite people, and of course. And okay, here's my question.
Yeah, okay.
Is
tracking so far?
If I were to say somebody who doesn't really have what I consider considerable traumas, but they just want to work out issues, is that is there a line where you draw? Because I have a lot of students who have depression.
Yeah.
They're like, I hear about these new therapies. And I'm like, and they're like, I know you've done LSD before. I was like, look, my experience of LSD is not one that dictates anything. I definitely have friends who have bad trips who I can still like call out with
Sure.
a few words to
Yeah,
them, you know. But
yeah.
but yeah, I hesitate to say like, yeah, man, go for it as long as it's, you know, well researched, because I'm like, I don't know if everybody needs to be doing this or if it's really just for that specialized acute traumas that I can
Yes.
imagine.
Yeah. So I'm really glad you asked me the question. It's a really good question that I get asked, you know, pretty often. And, you know, like I can't speak professionally around like laws and regulations. Like I have to tell you, don't do anything illegal, don't be bad, don't, you know, et cetera, et cetera. All, you know, I'm not giving any professional advice. No doctor-patient relationship is being formed by listening to this podcast or by asking me this question or whatever, you know, like all of that baloney we run through, right? But on the other side of that, the way that me and some of my partners all think about those things is with an acronym called SHOT: stabilize, heal, optimize, and thrive. If somebody's in a crisis, in an emergency, and needs stabilizing, we can do that. And it's not at all going to involve psychedelics, unless we're talking about acute suicidality and ketamine-assisted therapy. That I think there's enough evidence behind using that intervention in appropriate people for stabilizing. But beyond that, that's not usually the case. And then healing involves things like MDMA-assisted therapy and ketamine-assisted therapy. The way that that's been explained to me by other people with much more experience doing it, because, you know, MDMA is not legal yet, but I have the training and I've read all the papers on it, that it's a good place to start is with MDMA and ketamine-assisted therapy in terms of healing.
To me, as somebody who's done not ketamine, I've never done ketamine.
Right. Yeah.
Somebody who did
you can think of it in terms of contracting and expanding. Yeah. So like MDMA and ketamine kind of contract somebody down and allow them to do interior work that's necessary for healing. If you skip straight to a rocket ship like LSD or psilocybin or some of the serotonin based psychedelics, or, you know, 5-MeO-DMT, and you're not ready for it, those are expansive medicines in terms of how to change your mind. Those open your mind up. But if you're not ready to be that opened, it feels like you're being pulled apart rather than expanding. And that's some of what's behind some of the psychology of a bad trip there, is you just weren't ready for that trip. You hadn't done the work interiorly to do some of those things, is how some people talk about that. And there's disagreements, you know, over whether like every trip you get is exactly the trip you were supposed to have, or, you know, like the Calvinistic version of so like psychedelic assisted therapy.
15-year-old, you know, adolescent boys running through the woods dropping LSD does not sound like we were prepared.
I mean, maybe it depends on the 15-year-old and where the woods are or something.
I'm just telling you right now. Not a single one of us were prepared.
He wasn't ready.
Explains a lot, yeah.
The optimizing and the thriving stuff, I think there's a place for that, and it hasn't, you know, like it's not, again, because of legalities, not been, you know, well explored out in the broad daylight yet. But I think we're on the cusp of the potential for a lot of the, you know, the stuff Michael Pollan describes. I don't think you have to have refractory PTSD or quote unquote treatment resistant depression to benefit from these sorts of things at all. It's really interesting that he chose to title the book "How to Change Your Mind" from, you know, a Christian perspective, given the background on what the word repentance means and how it's metanoia is changing your mind. And that gets misunderstood a lot of the time as like, well, I was going to go left and then I turned right. And it's more like changing your diaper, like change your mind like a diaper. You're taking off an old mind and putting on a new mind. And that's a lot of what's going on, you know, metaphorically, with the science underlying a lot of the classical psychedelics. So again, you know, just my personal, not professional opinion around a bunch of that stuff is, yeah, there's absolutely potential for not just healing work, but also optimizing and thriving through the use of the rational use of psychedelics, if I can say it that way. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very helpful. I like that shot. Stabilize, healing, optimize.
Instead of stabilize, heal, integrate, and thrive, we say stabilize, heal, and optimize and thrive.
Houston Institute of Technology, right? Isn't that what it was called?
I've been there. That's combat medic school, baby. Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate you asking that question, and I appreciate you answering all 5 of mine. You got anything else you want to say to our audience?
To these people? No.
There it is.
Merry Christmas.
Pugnacious. Merry
Christmas.
Christmas. Doc out.